Thanks for keeping your phones on silent. There will be time for a Q&A, so get your questions ready. And if you haven't yet picked up a pre-ordered book or you'd like to buy a book, you can do so at the desk over there after the event. We're here tonight to celebrate the release of On Liberalism with the author, Cass Sunstein. Cass Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard University, where he is the co-founder and co-director of the Initiative on Artificial Intelligence and the Law. Former administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, is the author of The Cost-Benefit Revolution, How Change Happens, Too Much Information, Sludge, Climate Justice, which are all published by MIT Press, great press, as well as Nudge and other books. On Liberalism offers a timely and clear understanding of liberalism, of its core commitments, of its breadth, its internal debates and evolving character, and ultimately its promise, and why we need it now more than ever. It also shows how and why liberalism has been and should be appealing to both the left and the right. Never more urgently needed, this book moves the conversation well beyond the reductive and inflammatory political sound bites of our moment and advances a compelling argument on behalf of liberalism as a foundation of freedom and self-government. Please join me in welcoming Cass Sunstein.
Thank you all for coming out on a Friday night. I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of this project, shall I? The secret history. This isn't going to be a novel. The start was in 2022 when I started writing notes to myself on liberalism. And the reason I was interested in that was people on the left, back in the ancient days, 2022, were attacking liberalism as associated with environmental horror, with racism and colonialism and imperialism, with sexism and capitalism in a bad way. So the left was marking liberalism as a kind of historical demon. Not everybody on the left, but that was present. At the same time, people on the right were urging that liberalism was dying, hooray for that, because the destruction of faith, the obliteration of the family, the rise in criminality and disorder, very bad things, capital V, capital B, capital T, were all associated with liberalism. So I thought this is an account of a bad thing which is unifying both the left and the right. And so I started scribbling what liberalism is, and this was like numbered paragraphs from 1 to approximately 40. And I thought it was much too academic to be worth putting in anything that people would actually read. And it was much too free from footnotes to be in any place academic. So I thought this was really something that would not see the light of day. I sent it to 2 people and said, should I do anything with this? And one of them said, you should send it to the New York Times, which I thought was a really ridiculous idea because it was very long and like it with references and such. But the person who told me to send it to the New York Times worked for the New York Times. Brett Stevens, the columnist, was the guy. And so I thought he kind of knows things. So I sent it to the Times, and the Times ran it. And I got the kind of reaction I've never gotten from any of my scribblings. People on the left wrote me and said, this is what I am. I'm a liberal. And there are people on the left with whom I share certain views who are illiberal, and I don't like that at all. They want to censor things, and I'm not for that. Or they'd say there are people on the left who ridicule and show contempt for religion, and that's terrible. That's not what liberalism is about. And the people on the left said there are people on the left who don't like the separation of powers. They want the president to do whatever he wants. And I don't agree with that. I believe in the separation of powers. So that was a noteworthy set of reactions. More noteworthy still were the reactions I got from people on the right, who said, I'm a conservative, and liberalism is what I want to conserve. They said that we have a tradition in our country, which Ronald Reagan is part of, that I value. I'm not excited about your former boss. That's my former boss, Barack Obama. I'm not keen on Joe Biden, but liberalism is something I honor and cherish. And so when I got all that reaction, typically if you write an op-ed, people tell you, you should go in a hole and live there. Or they tell you, why are you throwing those awful words in my newspaper? And this was a different kind of thing. So I thought maybe I should do a book, and the amazing MIT Press, which is in the house, was not averse to that idea, and there we go. Okay, so I've written a little book for you. You've just heard the preface to the book. The book is not a big book, but it's not a little book. You're about to hear a mini book. And the first chapter is about, forgive me, foundations. Adolf Hitler was not a liberal. Putin is not a liberal. Joseph Stalin was not a liberal. Hitler was very self-conscious, by the way, that liberalism was one of the things he was trying to destroy. If you don't believe in freedom of thought and freedom of speech, you're out of the liberal camp. If you reject freedom of religion, you're not a liberal. If you despise the rule of law, guess what? You're not. Orwell's 1984 is a shattering and I think currently relevant depiction of anti-liberalism. One of Orwell's villains offers this warning: if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. And consider this: Orwell had a sense of humor as well as being a horror novelist. All this marching up and down and cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour. Here the novel's chilling last words: but it was all right, everything was all right, the struggle was finished, he had won the victory over himself, he loved Big Brother. The power of 1984, I think, I got it kind of more clearly in the last 3 years than I had before. I've read it probably 4 times, is that Orwell has a sympathetic appreciation of the power of tyranny. It's not just that he hates tyranny, he's into it. And the account of he won the victory over himself, he loved Big Brother, there's a kind of erotic charge in that, which the author feels and is conveying to the reader. It's an amazing act of literary genius, I think, as well as, the principal theme is one of this is a nightmare, but it's more complicated than that. That's where the power of the novel comes from. More than at any point since World War II, have you noticed, liberalism is under pressure. There's a lot of marching up and down. People are cheering. A lot of them are waving flags. Many of them seem to love Big Brother. They hope that they've found him. On the right, a lot of people have given up on liberalism. They hold it responsible for a series of collapses: religion, morality, the family, decency. On the left, many people despise liberalism. They think that it's exhausted and old and dying. They refer to neoliberalism with disdain. They certainly don't respect the liberal political tradition. Fascists reject liberalism. So do populists who think that freedom is overrated. In ways large and small, anti-liberalism is on the march. There's a paper by 2 psychologists from decades ago who said the refutation of a caricature can be no better than a caricature of a refutation. The refutation of a caricature can be no better than a caricature of a refutation. What anti-liberals on the left and the right have been rejecting is a caricature of a thing, that is liberalism, and what they've produced is a caricature of a rejection. They neglect the history of liberalism, which means that maybe more than ever, we need a clear understanding of liberalism, what our country, and maybe the Boston area, is the foundation of it all. Can you hear the ghosts around? Hear them? The Bostonians? What is a liberal? Any answer has to start by saying something about freedom. Liberals are committed to freedom of religion. They insist on freedom of speech. They don't merely acknowledge pluralism and the freedom that makes it possible. They cherish these things. They are committed to the rule of law. They welcome dissent, and they believe in experiments in living. Let me say a little word about that. I was in China a number of years ago, and a shoe, probably was a Rockport shoe, like one of these, broke, and I couldn't walk in Beijing because I didn't have a functioning shoe. And I asked my host, what do you do when your shoes don't work? And he said, there's a guy on the street corner, he'll fix your shoe. So I went to the street corner and I asked the guy to fix my shoe, and he did. And he had some English, so I got to talk to him. And I said, you're fixing shoes, how are things? And he had a huge smile on his face. He said, the government has a new initiative by which we can start small businesses. We don't have to share our money with the government. We don't have to get special permission. We can just do this. And as he described it, I'm trying to capture the energy and kind of skipping that he was conveying when he was describing his job, which was an experiment. I have someone in my family who it's a regular job, he makes a living, he works for people, and it's okay, it's fine, he gets to feed himself, but he's creative, and he's decided to make movies. And he makes movies that are on YouTube, and they're pretty good, and he has some chance of actually becoming a movie maker of some kind. That's where his heart lives, that's where his soul is. And he's engaged in an experiment of living as kind of working. If you think about people who, let's say, love each other, but are both men, or love each other and are both women, or love each other but are not married, or love each other but there's some non-trivial age difference, in a free society they get to be together, which is to say that some of the flowering of the right of privacy over the last decades is legitimately called a flowering of the liberal tradition. Okay, that's foundations. Now let's talk, shall we, about chapter 2, where chapter 2 is about commitments. And what I'm going to do right now is give you a numbered list of commitments, and they are meant as offering a flavor of what liberalism is founded on, and the list is designed to be a little more specific than I've been so far. So you've heard preface, chapter 1, foundations, chapter 2 now, there are only 3 chapters, and that's commitments. Liberals believe in 6 things: freedom, human rights, pluralism, security, the rule of law, and democracy. So that's the list. FHPSRD. It's not an acronym, I'm so sorry. Actually, they believe in a conception of democracy that is deliberative, meaning there's a commitment to accountability, we the people are in charge, but there's also a commitment to reason giving, that the people whom we put in charge aren't allowed to do things just because they want to, they have to give a reason for it. It's a reason-giving democracy. 2, liberal authoritarianism is an oxymoron. Because liberals believe in freedom, personal security, and pluralism, they reject authoritarianism in all its forms. In Hungary, leader Orban has insisted on the importance of illiberal democracy. Illiberal democracy is illiberal, and liberals oppose it for that reason. 3, liberals know that reasonable people disagree on a lot of things, including the nature of a good life and which God to worship, if any. They want to make space for those disagreements. E pluribus unum on the currency. That's not just a slogan, it's a way of life. 4, liberals don't merely acknowledge pluralism, understood of the diversity of ways of living and commitments, they cherish it as a way to ensure that people can learn from each other and benefit from experiments in living. Liberals want people who disagree with each other to find a way to live together and to smile, or at least to nod respectfully at their differences. Liberals embrace these words from John Stuart Mill, the hero of this book, and the source of the only romantic chapter I've ever written, which is in the book. So you really should get the book, romantic chapter. Here's what Mill said: "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no grounds for preferring either opinion." 5, the liberal emphasis on pluralism is closely associated with the liberal commitments to freedom and security. Those who reject pluralism render people unfree and insecure, and sometimes imprison or kill them. When I was a law student, I read a sentence from one of these huge law books where an old justice named Felix Frankfurter, who when he wrote the word seemed old and probably, and to a law student seemed like ancient. He said the history of freedom in England and America is in large part a history of procedural safeguards. And I'm amazed that I remembered that sentence, because it's a boring sentence. And I think I know why I remembered it, because I thought it was such a terrible sentence. I thought, how could you think the history of freedom in England and America is the history of procedural safeguards? I thought the equivalent before the phrase was common of WTF. But Frankfurter was right. If you look at our country now, or if you look at Russia now, or China now, it's really important. If you're going to lose your job, or lose your place in the country, or lose your freedom, that there be some sort of process in which there's an independent judge who has to be convinced that you did what you're accused of doing and that you violated the law. That is not, by the way, that's completely fundamental. Okay, 6, if we understand liberalism in this way, it consists of identifiable commitments. That means that those who consider themselves to be conservatives may or may not be liberals. Those who consider themselves to be leftists may or may not be liberals. You can be a liberal, as understood here, and a conservative. I worked for Ronald Reagan in the early days. He believed in the rule of law, freedom of speech, pluralism, and freedom of religion. There were early days in the Reagan administration. I was a lawyer in the Justice Department, where Reagan and his top people wanted to do things that violated the law. Not that they wanted to violate the law. They wanted to do things involving abortion and school prayer and school busing that were part of the party platform. But they weren't inconsistent with the law. And he asked the Justice Department, can I do this? And the Justice Department said, no, you can't, Mr. President, it's not consistent with the law. And what the president personally said, and what his leading advisor said, was not, I'm the boss of the Justice Department, but instead, okay, Justice Department, we'll do something else. We're not going to violate the law. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Boston's own Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Ronald Reagan are all part of the liberal tradition. This is so, notwithstanding the fierce disagreements among them. doing this book, I used to love Franklin Delano Roosevelt and like Abraham Lincoln. I now love them both. I love Roosevelt because of his cheerfulness and American sunniness. Asked, why are you seeming to enjoy being the president? It's a horrible job. We have a war and a depression. How can you stand this? And he said, gosh, if you spend 2 years trying to wriggle your big toe, anything else would seem easy. That was FDR, who spent a lot of his life in a wheelchair because of polio. By contrast, Lincoln seemed kind of tortured and downbeat. But here's what Lincoln said in 1854. If a Negro is a man, is it not to that extent a total destruction of self-government to say that he too shall not govern himself? When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he, the white man, governs himself and also another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism. No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. I say this is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicans. See what Lincoln did there? It's brilliant and it's fast. It's like a fastball pitcher. He's saying that at the foundation of American republicanism, I live in Concord, I should say, so I kind of very much feel it in the air. The idea is that we get to govern ourselves, no king, that no one has a right to govern us except ourselves. That is American republicanism, small r. That's our commitment to democracy. And Lincoln quickly says slavery is antithetical to the foundation of our country, because it means someone gets to govern someone else without their consent. Lincoln calls it a sheet anchor, and that's a brilliant way to link self-government in people's individual capacities with self-government as a political ideal. I might add here, I worked in the Biden administration. I had a job under that president as well as Obama. And it won't surprise you, will it, to hear that there are a number of people who work for the Biden administration who are scared right now. Now, there are zillions of people who are more scared than people who have the privilege of access to a lawyer, et cetera. But they're scared right now. And freedom from fear, which is a core liberal idea, basically security against people who are clothed with public authority or not, that is foundational. And Lincoln's kind of capturing that too. A sheet anchor is no ordinary anchor. It's the most reliable one there is. It's the least likely to fail under stress. It's like a port in a storm. You can agree with Lincoln while having disparate views toward smoking, abortion, immigration, artificial intelligence, climate change, and the Second Amendment right to bear arms. 8. Liberals have always been committed to freedom. That's a historical core, but they haven't always been committed to democracy. We have to acknowledge that. Democratic and illiberal democracy is not consistent with liberalism because it's illiberal. Can you have liberalism without democracy? Lincoln thought not. He captured the underlying logic of liberalism in linking freedom in individual life with self-government. Freedom in your personal life, the right to self-governance, writ small, which I hope everyone here is able to enjoy, is connected with freedom in civic life, a right to self-governance writ large. 9, it's not a very long list, here's 9. Liberals are committed to individual dignity. They see people not as objects of other persons, but as subjects, and they prize the idea of agency. They agree with Lincoln, who said, stunning sentence, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. That's why they regard Mill's great book, The Subjection of Women, not as a kind of sidelight, but as helping to define the essence of liberalism. Thus, Mill wrote, the legal subordination of one sex to the other is wrong in itself and is now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. Emancipation movements of multiple kinds are closely connected with Mill's book. 10. Liberals know that authoritarians feel free to exercise power and to use force without justifying their choices. That's so in democracies as well as in non-democratic nations. They see reason-giving as a check on authoritarianism. Public power cannot be exercised on the ground that the king says so, the president says so, God says so, or even the people say so. That's not enough. 12. Liberals do not believe that their own approach is frozen in time. They emphasize that liberalism is not something to be found, but to be made. They don't fear change. In their view, liberalism is not like a rock. It is constantly growing like a tree. 13. What John Dewey said of the United States is also true of liberalism. Be the evils what they may, the experiment is not yet played out. The United States are not yet made. They are not a finished fact to be categorically assessed. When I was a kid growing up in Massachusetts, I was mostly focused on comic books and the Red Sox. And then at a certain age, I got kind of seized by William F. Buckley Jr. Do you remember him? He was charming, he was funny, he was witty, he seemed to know everything. He was irresistible, I thought, and his writing had verve, it had a kind of energy that kind of nobody had. He famously said in the first issue of his magazine, National Review, that his preferred form of conservatism stands athwart history, yelling stop. You can see maybe the conceptual origins of MAGA kind of in that idea, stop. Liberals ask history to explain its plans, and if the explanation is good enough, they're prepared to whisper, go. Chapter 3, last chapter. Some people think that freedom is incompatible with order. Have you noticed? Yes? Do I have to add another sentence? This is not a political speech. This is a shining light in our country's traditions. Those who believe that freedom is incompatible with order think that freedom will produce bad and dangerous choices. They see liberty as a threat. When freedom of speech is shut down, that is a common reason. And I should say I wrote that sentence a few weeks ago, not this morning. Many people believe that the rule of law is incompatible with security, and they suspend the rule of law in its name. Of course, many people deplore liberty because they seek to retain their power and their privilege. The rights that liberals prize are an outgrowth of Lincoln's sheet anchor. The right to vote, the right to free speech, the right to religious liberty, the right to due process of law. Liberals proudly say to the left, the right to private property is itself associated with Lincoln's sheet anchor, and we celebrate it. If you cannot own things, you're vulnerable to the power of others, above all, the government. No ism, including liberalism, offers concrete solutions to concrete social problems. You can agree with the liberal tradition without having clarity about whether an increase in the minimum wage is a good idea, and whether current initiatives to repeal climate change regulations are a good idea. You can be a liberal without knowing what to think about immigration. You can believe in freedom of speech without knowing how to handle deep fakes, libel, and commercial advertising. You can believe in freedom of religion without knowing whether it's permissible to apply prohibitions on race and sex discrimination to religious schools. So there's openness and humility in liberalism. Here's kind of I'll confess, I haven't told anyone this. I'll tell you all, even though I only know one of you well, who's in the room, which is that you're about to hear the emotional source of the book, kind of the deepest reason I wrote it. Early on, liberalism was full of fire. You can't read Mill's On Liberty without feeling the fire. He brings the heat. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, Mill writes, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. My gosh. Here's Benjamin Constant's Principles of Politics Applicable to All Governments, kind of the first liberal text in 1815, and he calls it, this is the title, Principles of Politics Applicable to All Governments. That's not fire free. That's insisting on liberal universalism. And here's what Constant, French guy, says. Political freedom would be a thing of no value if the rights of individuals were not sheltered from all violation. Any country where these rights are not respected is a country subjected to despotism, whatever the nominal organization of government may otherwise be. Till a few years ago, Constant wrote in 1815, these truths were universally recognized. Not true, but aspirational. Lasting errors and a long oppression under wholly contrary pretexts and quite opposite banners have thrown all ideas into confusion. That's a high energy form of liberalism. Liberalism with velocity. In 1971, Massachusetts' own John Rawls wrote the greatest liberal text of political philosophy, I think, ever. It's called The Theory of Justice. And notice, if you would, how quiet his last sentence is, how different from the fire. He writes gently, purity of heart, if one could attain it, would be to see clearly and to act with grace and self-command from this point of view. It's a little bit like some combination of a morning sermon and a funeral oration, isn't it? It's quieter. It would be extreme to say that over half a century after Rawls's book, to say with Yeats, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. But we can recognize that sentence, can't we? Yes? A little bit? It would be too strong to say that the best lack all conviction, meaning too harsh. But it wouldn't be extreme to say that current accounts of liberalism, including in our best newspapers and on television, have a defensive quality. They seem backward-looking, nostalgic, a bit tired and passive. In law and politics, as in sports, the best offense is sometimes a good defense. You all remember Bill Russell, the greatest winner in the history of basketball? He didn't score a whole lot. He had an astonishing defensive prowess. Still, the defining feature of liberalism has always been its youth, its energy and its fierceness, its delight in human agency, its receptivity to novelty and surprise, its high spirits, its opposition to cruelty, its capacity for indignation, its optimism, its continuing adventures in self-definition, its refusal to despair, its sense of mischief, its commitment to experiments in living. Liberalism is full of hope. Hopeful people are remaking it every day. Thank you. So, thank you for listening. The floor is open for questions, comments.
Hi, so in the book, you make the point that free speech and liberalism contend the best response to offensive speech, not deplatforming or cancellation, rather counter-arguments. My question is, how do we get those counter-arguments heard when we're all siloed in echo chambers and we're not exposed to counter-arguments?
That's a fantastic question. So there have been times in human history when access to diverse people was available to diverse people. And if not personally, at least there'd be someone on CBS News or on ABC News who would say various things. And then, as you say, we would have a culture that had a degree of commonality in it. The rise of social media and the internet has created echo chambers or information cocoons in which people are often listening to louder and louder versions of their own voice. I listen, I don't know if you can tell, I'm not saying a lot about my political views. I'm left of center, not very, but yes. And I listen to conservative talk radio almost every day, radio 1200 on the AM dial. One reason I listen to it is I learn from it. Another is I kind of like this guy named Joe Pags. Do you know Joe Pags? Am I the only one in the room who knows Joe Pags? If any of you knows someone who knows Joe Pags, tell him he has a kind of fan. I'm fond of him because he seems warm. His kids have had real trouble and he clearly adores them. And what I particularly like about him is he's kind of a schlumpy guy. He's, you know, if you see pictures of him and he doesn't bill himself as Brad Pitt, come again. But he has, as some of the advertisements for him before he goes, he has a woman with a sultry voice saying, and now Joe Pags. And she says it as if, my God, and now Joe Pags. So he's funny about himself. And he jokes a lot about how he's getting more followers. He makes fun of himself a little bit. In any case, to listen to people who have very different views is educative, and it also tends to create a common culture. One thing I've learned from listening to 1200 is that people on the right and the far right are very worried about abridgments of freedom of speech, about intrusions on freedom of religion, and about lacking security. So there are a lot of gun ads there. And the gun ads are prefaced by, people are going to come from you. How are you going to take care of yourself? And you can get a gun. And some of the ads I find more interesting than I expected. There's a kind of gun called the burn-a-gun, which is described as having less lethal force. I would have thought lethal was a little like unique. Like it's an on-off. It's not like more or less. But you learn from that. It's possible to get access to in our individual lives, to people maybe in our family who think differently from what we do, and we can learn from them, and maybe vice versa, and see some commonality. So there's exchanges, and we've all had that, yes, whether you're right of center or left of center, with people who think very differently, and you can learn from them and maybe be moved on something, and vice versa. So it kind of starts here a little bit. You're completely right, our media culture is one where this isn't very genial. Can I tell you something that I was actually really moved by? One of the people I listened to on conservative radio was Glenn Beck. Do you know that name, Glenn Beck? And I listened to him mostly because he's the one who's on when I'm driving. but also because he had a campaign against me when I was nominated to one of my Washington jobs where I needed Senate confirmation, and boy, he went after me hard and savagely. He described me as the most dangerous man in America, I think over 100 times. And there's something funny about that, but when I received death threats at my unlisted home address, that wasn't an entertaining moment. And dangerous is a very bad thing to be called the most evil. He called me the most evil man in America. I thought, my gosh, I can't be the most evil. There must be at least one more evil than I. So it went after me really hard. And I listened to him and I want to like him. I really want to like him. I've had a kind of hard time liking him. Not because of anything about politics, but he doesn't seem to have a whole lot of grace. But today he knocked my socks off. I just turned it on randomly. And he said, during the Civil War, Lincoln, after so many people had been killed, when kind of no one didn't have family members who were killed, said, with charity at all, for all, malice toward none, let us bind up these nations' wounds. And he said when he had Lee defeated, he didn't stamp, it's kind of an Orwellian echo, I'm sure inadvertent. He said he didn't stamp a boot on Lee's neck. He said, let him up, they've surrendered. And he talked about Lincoln's grace and a sense of commonality across differences. And then back to my surprise, and I wouldn't have known if I was, once I was listening, said, that's how we on the right have to be. We have to love people who maybe don't love us. That's what our country needs. And it was a claim for respect and recognition. And that's a start.
We sometimes hear the argument that we need to embrace illiberal acts in order to save liberal society. I'm thinking things like Japanese internment or Red Scare censorship or social media censorship during COVID, or recently probably a bunch of instances you could cite. What's your framework for evaluating the appropriateness of those illiberal acts? Is it obvious that they're never appropriate, or do you weigh pros and cons in an objective sense?
Okay, it's a great question. If everyone's potentially going to get very sick unless we require masks, then requiring masks is very much on the table. So things that are designed to protect life have a potential justification, even if they're intrusions on liberty. To put people in concentration camps because they have Japanese rather than Austrian ancestry, that's extreme, that's keenly illiberal, doubly illiberal. It's putting people away in some sense, and it's also discriminatory. So to do that, you need to have an overwhelming justification, and the government really lacked that. So for COVID, some things had a generality to them. It wasn't just Austrian. I say this because I have some Austrian ancestry myself. It wasn't just those of us with some Austrian ancestry have to wear masks, everyone, so there's generality. The Red Scare need to be very concerned with communism at the time. It was completely reasonable to be firing people or jeopardizing their liberty because they had left of center views, even very left of center views. That's not defensible. I mean, if you're spying for Russia, by all means, liberals don't need to protect that. But if you're saying, Marx was a great thinker, as I say that even, I feel freaked out because I kind of think he was a great thinker, but I despise him, not as a person, but as a thinker at the same time. But if people say that what Oliver Wendell Holmes said is we need to have freedom for the thought we hate. And that never resonated with me. It's so blunt. Freedom for the thought we hate. It's so kind of bare as a sentence. But right now, we need Holmes. We need the bareness, freedom for the thought we hate. So illiberal, there's always potential justification. Justice Robert Jackson said the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and liberalism isn't that either. But one thing is that the public officials, having been one 3 times, I kind of saw the temptation. You think you're right, because you're human and you might be right, and that leads to overconfidence about everything, including overconfidence maybe about the wrongness of people who disagree and the importance of taking steps to silence or minimize them. Can I tell you a story? I'll tell you a story that's relevant not to the censorship in the liberalism thing, but it's relevant to the echo chamber thing, and it's kind of broadly relevant to liberalism. I worked when I was working for President Obama on a regulation involving mercury, and it was a very expensive regulation. It was a regulation that would cost the country a lot, and it would also have, we believed, and I still believe, very big public health benefits. So we proposed it for public comment, and the most memorable comments came from a member of Congress, a very powerful member of Congress, who wrote maybe 10 single-spaced pages of objections to our rule, saying it's terrible this way, it's terrible this way, it's terrible this way, it's terrible this way. It was just a screed, but it was a political screed, but they did their work. It was not just adjectives and emotions. It was substantively pretty impressive. So we read it super carefully. They made maybe 12 points, and 8 of them turned out to be right, we thought, and 4 not so much. And to the 8 right ones, we changed the rule. So when we finalized it, we didn't do the thing they didn't like. And then the 4 we thought in the end the change would not be a good idea, would endanger public health. So it was the only time when I was in government that I called up a member of Congress on the day of an initiative. And I called him up and I said, thank you for your letter. It was a terrific letter, and 8 of the things you suggested were convincing. And we did that. And I said 4 we didn't, and here's why we didn't. And he sounded like, was this a prank call? He was very unsettled, but in a charming way. He was unsettled to get the call. And he said to me, gosh, he said, that's good. I mean, I don't agree with you on the 4, but I get it. And on the 8, I think that's the right direction, and this sounds okay. And he said, I'm going to release a press release from my office approving of what you have done. And my gosh, one of the president's main antagonists was going to issue a press release. He never did. I think he got back to his staff, and the staff said, have you lost your mind? But he didn't say a negative word about the rule, and that was massive. And since that time, he's a Washington person, so he knows a million people. He's always been super cordial to me. We're kind of on the same side of something. And I've learned, at that time he was a bit of a firebrand, I've learned that he's a source of commonality and of respectful engagement. And he's a listener. And I think if I and others had treated him as an enemy, maybe he would have gone in a different direction.
Thank you so much. This was real thought-provoking. So I'm a psychiatrist and also from Turkey, so I have first-hand experience in terms of the country kind of moving towards more authoritarianism. And I wonder if there's an internal factor actually that hinders the road to liberals, and there is the inherent need for a strong father figure, and also that the freedom is real scary. And what I hear from you, like liberals see the order of law as that father figure or as that kind of ruler. But can that actually compete with a real person that someone can love, someone can hate?
Yeah.
And maybe it wasn't a coincidence that actually Orwell, in 1984, there was this subtle appreciation of the Big Brother. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
If you're a psychiatrist, you get much better than I would the underlying appeal of Big Brother. And as I say, this I haven't gotten until recently. What makes 1984 so searing is some part of the reader's mind is rooting for Big Brother. It's irresistible the way Orwell does it. As horrible as that is, it gets to you. I don't know if Orwell was self-conscious about that, or was just such a genius that it emerged. Well, thank you on the rule of law. What does the rule of law mean? It means that you can't be punished without a hearing. It means that the law has to be clear and transparent. It means you can't be punished for things that weren't unlawful when you did them, so no retroactivity. It means the law has to be sufficiently stable that you know what it is. It means the law in the real world has to be like the law on the books. And to see that as essential to freedom, I think isn't that hard. To see it as having the same emotional appeal, this is what you're getting at, as a father figure who's going to protect you and slay your enemies, maybe not. So it's a work in political and psychological progress. I'm thinking that I worked for Obama, and he was very emphatic that he didn't want to be, Big Brother, anything like that. He wanted to be a person who was, he hoped, doing a good job. And that de-deifies the office. But there is a psychological, we all feel it, don't we, at some points? A psychological hope for a strong leader who will set everything right. The underrated prequels to the Star Wars movies, the prequels, which most people hate, but are secretly 3 of the best movies of all time, are all about this. Sir?
Are we mistaking Big Brother for George Washington?
Well, George Washington himself was very cautious about his George
He
Washington.
didn't want to stay very long as president.
Yeah, he didn't want to be a king or Big Brother, and he spoke in those terms. It's one of history's irony that George Washington kind of is deified, which points to the power of suggestion. But even those of us who love George Washington without having a lot of details about why we should love him, we don't think of him as, okay, another story for you. I was in China a few decades ago, and they took me to the big museum in Beijing, and my host took me to a little display for Genghis Khan, actually not a very big display, not a very little display, pretty big display. And I recoiled almost physically when I saw Genghis Khan. I said, a terrible tyrant. And he looked at me with, slight anger and complete confusion. And he said, "Oh, a great hero." And I thought, my gosh, I made an awful faux pas in China. The American guest has really put his foot in it, describing their hero as. And so I thought, what do I say? And I said as quickly as I could, American propaganda, which was an effort to rescue the social situation. And he responded to me very quickly, with much more certainty than I had. He said, no, Chinese propaganda. And that was that Genghis Khan, I guess the hero at that time to many, was in people's heart of hearts, not to be deified.
So how do you reconcile a framework where there's a macro level socio-political theories of liberalism and illiberalism with sort of the micro level of individual personalities that can have an outsized effect on the balance between those, even in a way that they may have no ideological preference, but their personal issues affect on the grand scale.
If we have a to liberalism's holy trinity, freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law, then we should be safe for a lot of individual personalities. Now, if there are individual personalities in the state, let's say, who despise freedom and the rule of law, then we're all at risk. And this is true in Washington too. So Madison, was responding to people thinking the Constitution wasn't enough or wouldn't do the job, it was bad. And what Madison said, if there's no virtue among us, we're all basically done. No Constitution can keep us secure. Everything depends on the people. So we called the Constitution parchment barriers. And we have to have a culture that's robust. In Turkey, I guess it's not working out perfectly. And in the US, it's the right word. We've occasionally had and are not now having challenging times.
Curious, what are some of your favorite bloggers and blog posts, podcast folks that are sort of pushing the idea of
I've spent a lot of the last years somewhere between 1810 and 1935. So my favorite bloggers are Friedrich Hayek. He's a really good blogger. Jeremy Bentham, that guy can. What a podcast Bentham had. John Rawls is a very good blogger. Robert Nozick I don't like quite so much, but he's a liberal and hooray for that. Joseph Raz is a very good podcaster. I'm being ridiculous here. In terms of podcasters and bloggers, Tyler Cowen is phenomenal, and he's a blogger and a podcaster. He's a liberal. He's off the charts good. Ezra Klein is, I think, excellent. He's not really, what's the right word? He's not really, forgive me, Mr. Klein, and those of you who love him as I do, he's not really a great reader of history, but he has a lightning quick mind and excellent judgment. So I'm very pro Ezra Klein. My old colleagues in the government, the Pod Save America team, you know them? John Favreau, Dan Pfeiffer, and John Lovett. They're all really good, and they're partisan. They are fundamentally liberals in the political theory sense. They are more committed to liberalism, meaning the defining values, than they're committed to the Democratic Party, though they're fiercely committed to both. And I love them all.
One more question?
Do you see a way to reconcile the shadow docket of the Supreme Court with the goal of having transparent rules, transparent laws?
I'm not as troubled as many are by the shadow docket. So here's the term is ominous. Yes, it sounds like a villain in the shadow.
We call it the emergency zone.
Yeah, I'm not so bugged by it. So there's a normal docket where in the normal course the Supreme Court hears cases. So some state suppresses freedom of speech and they go to the lower court and they lose, and then they go to an intermediate court and they lose, and then they go to the Supreme Court. It's very normal order. There might be a case where something happens, let's say the president is being put on trial, or something else happens where there's a tariff policy that's struck down, and it's kind of important to get that resolved quickly, and to bring it up quickly for something in the general category of expedited treatment. If that was the only problem facing our country today, or if that was in the top list of the top 5, we'd be fine. Now, what happens under the shadow docket, we can worry over. And it is true that some of the things, the court just doesn't have time to figure it out, which means that the court might do something that's kind of holding pattern. It's like a plane in the sky that doesn't land, or it might do something that's insufficiently considered because they haven't had weeks and months they need. But on a scale of 10, in terms of concern about the shadow docket, I'm around 3. Whereas what's happening in, you can think of a domain where you're very concerned, it would be substantively, like what's happening to our media right now. The concern is, let's just say, high. I think a reasonable concern is higher than 3. At least 3.5.
You'd be unable to determine what the deliberations were inside the shadow document.
Well, you can't see the deliberations anywhere. The deliberations are secret. All you get is an opinion. Now, the opinion from the shadow docket cases, they're typically short, and they're less thick with reasons. Sometimes there's no reason, they just say the petition is granted, and that's not great. That's why the concern is 3, not 0. But, you know, what's the court supposed to do? If the case is really something where a policy, you know, involving tariffs or something is in limbo, it can't be in limbo for 8 months. So the court has to decide it. So, I mean, it may be that what the court is doing there is wrong. That's very possible. But it's not,